Boy, the sawmill's using your land as a dump now, and you're just gonna stand there and smile about it. Marcus was 16. He looked at the massive maple slabs on the ground, then back at the neighbor. "We made an arrangement," he said. "An arrangement." Roy Greer laughed from his truck window. "That's a real nice word for taking somebody's garbage. What exactly are you going to do with all that? Build yourself a bonfire?" Marcus crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the grain. "Not sure yet, but I'll figure it out." Roy shook his head and drove on. 8 years later, he would regret that laugh for the rest of his life. Calder Mills was the kind of place where people knew which families had been there for generations and which ones were still being tested. The Ellis property sat at the eastern edge of town, 9 acres of thin soil and field grass that produced nothing of value and asked nothing in return. The barn at the back of the lot leaned slightly to the left, its roof holding against the weather through habit more than structure. Marcus had grown up looking at that barn the way kids look at things they've always known without really seeing them. His mother, Diane, worked the night shift at the Holt County packaging plant, a job that paid enough to keep the lights on and not much else. She was home by 6 in the morning, asleep by 7, and back on her feet by 3 in the afternoon, moving through the kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste motion. She didn't complain about the schedule. She didn't complain about much. What she talked about when she talked was Marcus, what he was reading, how he was doing in school, whether he was eating enough. She carried the future of that household in the same quiet way she carried everything else. Marcus's grandfather, Earl Ellis, had built the barn with 2 other men in the summer of 1971. Earl had been a woodworker by instinct and a laborer by necessity, a man who could read the grain of a board the way other men read weather. He passed when Marcus was 9, leaving behind a chest of hand tools, a workbench bolted to the barn floor, and a habit of saying things that only made sense years later. One of those things was this: "The land doesn't care what you think of it. It only cares what you do with it." Marcus had not known what to do with any of it. The land, the tools, the words. He was 16, doing well enough in school to stay out of trouble, working weekend hours at a hardware store in town, and trying not to think too hard about what came next. The future had a texture to it in Calder Mills that felt fixed. You could see it in the way people talked about college, like it was something that happened to other families. Marcus wasn't bitter about it. He just hadn't found a reason yet to believe it could go differently for him. That reason showed up on a Tuesday morning in the form of Dale Hutchins. Dale was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s who ran operations at the Grantham Sawmill 3 miles east on Route 9. He drove a company truck and wore the same expression, whether he was delivering good news or bad, steady, unhurried, like a man who had said difficult things often enough that the words no longer cost him anything. He knocked on the front door of the Ellis house at 8:30, held his cap in both hands, and introduced himself to Diane before asking if her son was around. Marcus came to the door, still holding a piece of toast. Dale explained the situation without dressing it up. Grantham processed timber for flooring and cabinetry, and the operation produced a significant volume of material the mill couldn't use commercially. Live edge slabs with irregular shapes, oversized pieces that wouldn't fit the standard equipment boards with mineral streaks running through the grain or wormhole patterns that buyers rejected outright. These weren't damaged pieces. They were just inconvenient ones. For years, the mill had been trucking them to a disposal yard at $70 a load, and the cost had become steady enough to bother the accountants. Dale had driven past the Ellis property enough times to notice the unused back acreage. He was not there to do Marcus a favor. He was there because the back corner of that land solved a logistics problem. The arrangement he proposed was direct the mill would use the far end of the property as a drop point, pay a small monthly fee, and remove any remaining wood after 6 months if the family didn't want it. Marcus looked past Dale at the truck idling at the edge of the gravel drive. Then he asked the question that had come to him immediately, the one he suspected most people in his position might not think to ask. "What's the wood actually worth?" Dale considered the question without hurry. To us, nothing. We can't move it. The commercial buyers won't touch anything that doesn't fit standard specs, and we don't have the setup to mill it down further. He turned his cap once in his hands. To someone who knew what to do with it, I honestly couldn't say. Diane was standing behind Marcus. He could feel her hesitation without looking at her. Accepting cast-offs from the mill from an operation that had been running in this county since before the Ellis family had owned a square foot of it carried a weight that had nothing to do with wood. She knew how it would read to certain people. Knew the way the story would get told at the diner and the hardware store and the church parking lot. The Black family is taking the Sawmill's garbage now. Marcus knew it too. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to remember his grandfather's workbench, still bolted to the barn floor. Still holding. He told Dale they'd take the arrangement. The first load arrived the following Tuesday. 2 enormous maple slabs, each one close to 8 feet in length, bark still attached along the live edges, hit the ground with a sound that carried across the field. Marcus walked out and stood over them. The wood was raw and heavy, and smelled of something green and recent. He crouched down and ran his hand along the surface, the way he had watched his grandfather do, slowly, without purpose, yet just reading. His grandfather had said something once while doing exactly that. They had been in the barn together on a Saturday, Earl running his palm along a warped board someone had set out for trash collection. Marcus had been young enough to find the whole thing strange. Why spend time on something that looked so broken? Earl hadn't answered right away. He kept moving his hand along the grain, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't loud. People throw away what they don't understand. That's not cruelty. That's just limits. The question is whether you're going to let someone else's limits tell you what something is worth. Marcus had been too young to hold on to it then. But standing over those maple slabs at 16, with the mill truck already gone, and the neighborhood quiet in the way it got when people were watching without wanting to be seen watching, the words came back to him clean and whole. That evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote 2 words at the top wood furniture. He stared at them for a while. He did not have tools beyond his grandfather's old set, did not have money for equipment, did not have training of any kind. What he had was a barn, a workbench that had been waiting for over a decade, and a piece of land that people had just started bringing material to. He thought about what Dale had said, to someone who knew what to do with it. He didn't know what to do with it yet. That was the problem. And it was also he was starting to understand the entire point. Diane found the paper the next morning when she came home from her shift. She stood in the kitchen reading those 2 words while her coffee brewed still in her work clothes, still carrying the night on her shoulders. She set the paper back down exactly where she'd found it. She didn't say anything about it when Marcus woke up. But that afternoon she came home from an errand with 2 library books, one on basic woodworking, one on furniture joinery, and left them on the kitchen table without comment. That was Diane Ellis. She didn't declare things. She just moved in the direction of what she believed. Marcus opened the first book that night and didn't put it down until after midnight. By the end of the week, he had read both books twice. He had also gone out to the barn and spent an hour with his grandfather's tools, getting the feel of what was there. A set of chisels that needed sharpening, 2 hand planes, a mallet with a cracked handle that could be wrapped, and saved a measuring square that was still true. Not much. Enough to start making mistakes with. The maple slabs sat outside on the ground. He understood from the books that they needed to stay there for a while. Green wood was unstable, liable to move in ways that would ruin any work done too early. He needed to wait. He marked the date on a calendar pinned inside the barn door and drew a line forward by 12 months. A year. He had a year before the wood would be ready. That meant a year to learn something before the material was. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning. There was nothing to tell yet. But something had shifted in the way he looked at the barn in the evenings. It no longer looked like a leftover from someone else's life. It looked like the beginning of something that hadn't been named yet, in a place where people had already decided nothing much was going to happen. Marcus had not decided that. He had decided the opposite. And he went to bed that night the same way his grandfather used to finish a day in the shop with sawdust on his hands that wasn't from any real work yet, but would be. The first year was mostly about being wrong. Marcus spent those 12 months reading, watching, and waiting for the maple to dry while he practiced on cheaper lumber bought in small quantities with money from the hardware store job. He learned that wood had opinions. It split when he rushed it, warped when he ignored moisture, and splintered when his chisels weren't sharp enough, which was most of the time at the beginning. His grandfather's tools were good tools built for a man who knew how to use them. In Marcus's hands, they were a constant reminder of how much he still didn't know. By the time the maple was ready, he had ruined enough pine boards to fill half the barn with kindling. He had also gotten better. Not skilled, not yet, but better. His joints were cleaner. His measurements were more consistent. He had learned to read the grain before making any cut, the way the lines in the wood told you where it wanted to go and where it would resist. He had learned that fighting the material was always a losing proposition. The wood had been growing for decades before he touched it. It had its own logic, and his job was to understand it, not override it. The first piece he attempted in maple was a small side table. He chose a slab that had dried, evenly milled the surface with his grandfather's hand plane until it was flat, and cut the legs from a secondary board that Dale had included in one of the later deliveries. The joinery was mortise and tenon, the most basic connection in furniture making and also the most unforgiving, because if the fit was wrong, everything that followed was wrong. Marcus cut the mortises by hand, chiseling slowly, checking the fit every few passes. It took him 3 days to cut what an experienced woodworker might have done in an afternoon. The table held. It wasn't beautiful, but it was level and solid, and when he pressed down on the top with both palms and felt no give at all, something settled in him that had been unsettled for a year. He kept going. The second piece was a coffee table with a full live edge on one side, the bark preserved along the curve. He chose a simple oil finish, working it into the surface with a cloth in long, even strokes. The grain came alive under the oil in a way that stopped him mid-stroke. He stood there looking at what the wood had been hiding under its raw surface, the depth of it, the way the figure in the grain caught light differently depending on angle. He understood then why his grandfather had spent so many evenings in that barn. It wasn't just the making. It was the moment when the material became itself. The coffee table was the piece he brought to Cal Whitmore. Cal ran the only independent woodworking shop within 40 miles of Calder Mills, a converted garage on the south end of Harding Road that smelled of linseed oil and cedar shavings. He was in his late 60s, a compact and deliberate man who had learned the trade from his own father and had been working alone for so long that the shop had taken on the particular silence of someone who preferred it that way. His reputation in local woodworking circles was modest, but specific. He was the person people mentioned when they wanted to describe what careful work looked like. Marcus had found Cal's name through a woodworking forum he accessed at the library. He drove to Harding Road on a Saturday morning, the coffee table wrapped in moving blankets in the bed of his mother's truck, and knocked on the shop door. Cal opened it, looked at Marcus, and said he didn't take on students. He said it the way people say things that have been said often enough to become policy. Not unkind, just closed. Marcus thanked him and left. He sat in the truck for a few minutes with the engine off. Then he got out, pulled the moving blankets off the coffee table, and carried it to the shop door. He set it on the ground in front of the entrance and knocked again. When Cal opened the door this time, Marcus stepped aside so Cal could see the table clearly. Cal looked at it for a long time. He crouched down and examined the joinery where the stretcher met the leg. He ran his thumb along the live edge where Marcus had cleaned up the bark transition. He tilted his head and looked down the surface of the top, checking for flat. His expression didn't change. but something in the quality of his attention did. "Where'd you get the slab?" Cal asked. Marcus told him about the Grantham arrangement, the maple coming in every Tuesday, the 9 acres, the barn, the year spent learning on pine before touching any of it. Cal stood up. "I still don't take on students," he said, "but I'm in the shop most mornings by 7. I don't lock the door until I'm working." He went back inside. That was the whole of it. No invitation, no terms, no acknowledgement of what it meant. But the door wasn't locked the following Tuesday morning when Marcus arrived at 6:55 and Cal didn't tell him to leave. He just worked and Marcus watched. And when Marcus asked a question, Cal answered it without elaboration. That was the arrangement for the better part of a year. What Marcus learned in that shop was different from what the books had given him. Books could describe technique, but they couldn't show him how Cal held a marking gauge or the particular angle at which he presented a hand plane to figured maple to avoid tear-out. They couldn't replicate the way Cal would stop in the middle of a cut and hold the piece to the light coming through the north-facing window, reading the surface slowly with complete attention, as if the wood were telling him something he needed to hear before he could continue. Marcus kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. He drove to Harding Road 3 mornings a week before the hardware store opened, and he brought every lesson back to the barn in Calder Mills, where the Tuesday deliveries had built up a supply of dried maple that was beginning to look to anyone paying attention like serious inventory. One morning toward the end of that year, Cal watched Marcus work through a difficult section of figured grain without asking for guidance and without making the mistake Cal had expected him to make. Cal set down his own tools. "You don't need to keep coming here," he said. It wasn't a dismissal. It was the closest Cal came to a compliment, and Marcus understood it that way. On his last morning on Harding Road, Cal handed him a marking gauge without ceremony, the one Marcus had watched him use on every piece since the first day, and went back to work without another word. Marcus drove home with the gauge on the seat beside him. He didn't return to Harding Road after that. He didn't need to. By the time he was 17 and a half, he had finished 8 pieces, 4 tables of varying sizes, 2 sets of bookends cut from figured maple offcuts, a small wall shelf with butterfly joints inlaid across a crack in the slab, and a bench with a live edge top. The bench he placed at the end of the hallway at home, at the spot where he had watched his mother sit every morning to take off her work shoes. Diane hadn't asked for it. When she sat down on it the first time and ran her hand across the top, she didn't say anything about the wood or how long it must have taken. She just said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." Marcus had not needed to hear anything else. He entered 3 pieces in a regional craft market in Stowe the following spring, renting table space with money saved from the hardware store job and loading the truck before dawn. The organizers placed his booth at the far end of the exhibition hall, past the pottery and hand-sewn quilts away from the main foot traffic. By the end of the day, he had sold nothing. He drove home with the truck still full and sat in the barn for a while without turning on the lights. The pieces were good, not because of pride, but because Cal had taught him to evaluate his own work honestly, and the work had passed that standard. But knowing something was good and finding the people who could recognize it were entirely different problems. He went back the following month. Same result. A third time, a woman in her 50s stopped in front of the live edge coffee table, ran her hand across the surface, the way people do when they're not thinking about it, stayed for almost 2 minutes without speaking, and then walked away. Marcus watched her go. He had stopped expecting the sale. He was there to understand what drew people in and what lost them. Roy Greer happened to be at the same market that third visit, browsing the stalls with his wife. He passed Marcus's booth and slowed. He looked at the pieces with the particular attention of someone recalibrating something. He didn't stop, but as he moved on, he said, "That's actual work." He kept walking. Marcus heard it. He went back to Stowe in June. A couple renovating a farmhouse outside Burlington bought the coffee table for $240. They shook his hand, complimented the piece twice in the parking lot, and drove away. Marcus stood there and counted the cash. $240 for 3 days of work and months of dried wood. It didn't cover what the time was worth. What it covered was something harder to calculate: the fact that two people who didn't know him had looked at his work and decided it deserved to come home with them. He put the money in his pocket and started planning the next piece. Then the bottom dropped out. It happened on an otherwise ordinary Thursday in September. Marcus was in the barn when he heard Diane's car come up the drive 3 hours before her shift ended. He came out and found her sitting in the driver's seat, still in her work clothes, not moving. She had been struck by a pallet jack that a new operator lost control of in the loading bay. Her right knee had taken the impact. She would need surgery. Recovery was estimated at 12 to 14 weeks, and the plant's injury compensation covered a fraction of her normal wage. Marcus went inside and wrote the numbers out on paper. He looked at them for a long time. Without Diane's full wages, the household ran short within 2 months, maybe 3, if they were careful about everything. A job at the county packaging plant was the obvious answer. He knew the hiring manager through the hardware store. It would take one phone call. He did not make the phone call that night. He went to the barn instead and stood in the middle of it with the lights on, looking at the inventory around him. 11 dried maple slabs, all of them material. No commercial operation had wanted all of them waiting. He thought about what Dale had said more than a year ago to someone who knew what to do with it. He thought about the couple in the Burlington parking lot. He thought about his grandfather's words. The land doesn't care what you think of it. It only cares what you do with it. Then he thought about his mother sitting in the driver's seat, not moving. That was the night that made everything harder, and also everything clearer. The packaging plant job would solve the immediate problem and permanently close the one he was trying to open. He understood that in the way you understand things at 18, when the full weight of a decision is visible for the first time. He picked up a piece of maple from the stack. A long, narrow slab with a slight curve in the live edge, the grain running clean and straight through the center. He set it on the workbench and turned on the lamp his grandfather had wired to the rafter above. He picked up a hand plane. He worked until 2 in the morning. He did not contact the packaging plant. Instead, he approached the owners of 3 local businesses, a coffee shop, a barber, and a small law office, and offered a single piece for display on a short-term loan, no charge, with his contact information attached. 2 of the 3 said yes. He placed a narrow shelf in the coffee shop and a small side table in the barber's waiting area, and taped a card with his name and number to the underside of each piece. It was not a marketing strategy. It was the only idea he had. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if anything would work. What he knew was that the barn was full of material, his hands knew what to do with it, and doing nothing was a choice he had already ruled out. He went home, checked on his mother, and set his alarm for 5:30 so he could get 2 hours in the barn before opening the hardware store. He was 18 years old. He had $240 of proven sales, 11 maple slabs, a workbench that had been there since before he was born, and a problem he had not yet solved. He also had the only thing that had ever turned overlooked material into something irreplaceable. He was paying attention, and he had not stopped. The coffee shop piece moved first. Not sold, noticed. A woman came in on a Wednesday morning, ordered something she didn't finish, and spent most of her time at the counter photographing the narrow maple shelf Marcus had placed near the east-facing window. She posted the image without tagging anyone or naming the maker. The caption said something about light and wood and mornings that feel like they're worth something. The post found its way to people who responded to that kind of language, and one of those people was Brooke Sanderson. Brooke handled interior design for cabin renovations across 3 states. She was practical in the way that people become practical when they are permanently overbooked. She made decisions quickly, trusted her eye, and had little patience for suppliers who couldn't deliver what they'd promised. She had seen a great deal of furniture that tried to look handmade, and not much that actually was. The shelf in the photograph looked different to her in a way she couldn't immediately explain, which was precisely the kind of thing she had learned to follow. She found the card taped under the shelf on a Thursday afternoon and called the number that evening. Marcus was in the barn when his phone rang. Brooke introduced herself, without excess explained what she did and how she had found him, and asked 2 questions. What was his lead time on a dining set, and could he handle a consistent volume of work? Marcus told her 6 weeks on the dining set. Brooke said to make it 8. She said she would rather wait than have him rush, and that she had been burned enough times by people who promised fast and delivered careless to know the difference mattered. She asked if she could come see the workshop before they went further. Marcus gave her the address. She arrived the following Saturday without calling ahead, which he would later understand was how she evaluated everyone. Show up unannounced and you see what's actually there, not what someone prepared for you. She walked into the barn and stood in the middle of it for a long time, without speaking. She looked at the inventory along the wall. She examined the dining table Marcus had been working on, running her hand along the surface with the attention of someone who had touched a great deal of wood over the years and knew what they were feeling for. She crouched down and looked at the joinery where the apron met the leg. Then she stood up and looked at Marcus directly. "How old are you?" she asked. 18, he said. Something settled in Brooke's expression, not surprise exactly, but the specific adjustment of someone who had expected one thing and found another. "The dining set. 8 weeks. And I'll need 2 more pieces after that, probably within the quarter." She named a price that was more than Marcus had made in 6 months at the hardware store. He kept his face steady. "I can do that," he said. What Brooke brought was not luck. It was the consequence of 3 years of work finding its way to someone equipped to recognize it. She placed his pieces in a cabin renovation outside Burlington, and the designer who photographed the finished interior for a regional architecture publication included a detail shot of the dining table. It was a small mention, 1 image, 1 line of credit naming the material and the county, but not the maker. It was enough. Garrett Mosley saw the photograph. Garrett was a developer who built high-end cabins across the Northeast, and he had a specific problem that money alone couldn't solve. He was tired of furnishing properties with pieces that looked like they had come from a catalog. His buyers paid for the feeling that something was singular, grown from the specific geography of the place. He had been looking for a furniture maker who understood that instinctively rather than as a performance. And the table in the photograph looked like someone who understood it. He contacted Brooke. She gave him Marcus's number. Garrett drove to Calder Mills on a Tuesday, which meant he arrived at the same time as the Grantham truck. He pulled up to the property and sat in his car, watching the driver lower the hydraulic bed and let a new slab slide to the ground. Wide, curved along the live edge, the grain visible even from the distance of the driveway. Garrett got out and walked over to where Marcus was already crouching beside it, 1 hand on the surface. "What is that?" Garrett asked. Marcus explained the arrangement, Dale Hutchins, the disposal problem, the Tuesday deliveries, the 8 years of maple built from what the mill couldn't sell. He did not frame it as a story. He just told it the way it was. Garrett listened, then walked into the barn and spent 15 minutes moving through the space finished pieces works in progress, stacked slabs along the walls. He came back out and stood in the yard. "Can you scale this?" he asked. "I'd need help," Marcus said. "Then get help." Garrett said it the way practical people state obvious things without drama, without the suggestion that it required further discussion. He needed to furnish 6 properties in the Champlain Valley. He named the scope. He named a rate that reflected the full market value of what Marcus was producing. It was the first time anyone had paid Marcus at the rate his work actually warranted. After Garrett left, Marcus sat on the barn floor with his back against his grandfather's workbench. He looked at the slab that had come off the truck that morning. He looked at the inventory. He looked at the tools on the wall, the chisels that had needed sharpening when he found them, The hand planes that had taken a year to use properly Cal's marking gauge on its hook above the bench. Getting help meant trusting someone else's hands with material he had spent years learning to understand. It meant the barn would need to change better lighting, a stronger floor equipment that ran on more than one person's income. It meant the operation that had been entirely his, built in silence, while the county road ran past outside, would become something larger than he could contain alone. He thought about it for exactly one evening. Then he called two brothers he had known since middle school, Ray and Curtis Dowell, who had grown up helping their uncle restore farmhouses across 3 counties, and who understood wood the way people understand a language they learned before they could read. Ray was 22. Curtis was 20. Neither of them had found work that used what they actually knew how to do. Marcus explained what he needed Garrett's commission. Brooks' ongoing work the inventory, the Tuesday deliveries that kept replenishing it. He told them what he could pay to start honest rather than generous, and what he expected the work to grow into if they built it carefully. Ray asked one question. "The wood, is there enough of it?" Marcus told him to come look. Ray and Curtis stood in the barn the following afternoon and looked at the stacked maple with the eyes of people who knew what they were looking at. Curtis pulled a slab from the middle of the stack and examined the end grain, checking the growth rings. He set it back without comment, but the way he handled it told Marcus everything he needed to know. They started the following Monday. The barn changed. Marcus reinforced the floor, added overhead lighting on 2 new circuits, and brought in a bandsaw and a thickness planer that Ray had located through a shop closing 2 counties over. The space that had been 1 person working alone became 3 people working in the particular quiet of people who respected what they were doing. There was not much conversation during work hours. There didn't need to be. The maple slabs, the ones with mineral streaks, the ones with irregular edges, the ones with wormhole patterns that commercial buyers had turned away for years, were now being pulled from inventory with intentions selected for specific commissions matched to the requirements of each piece. What the mill had discarded as unusable Garrett's clients were now paying to own, specifically because no 2 pieces could ever be the same. Diane's knee healed through the winter. She returned to the packaging plant in January and came home to a barn that looked entirely different from the one she had watched her son disappear into for 3 years. She stood in the doorway one February afternoon while all 3 of them were working and didn't come in, not wanting to interrupt. Marcus noticed her there and raised a hand. She raised one back and went inside to start dinner. She didn't say much about what the barn had become. The bench in the hallway was still there, still in use every morning. Some things you say with what you make. By the time Marcus turned 21, Ellis and Kin, the name he had settled on the kin for the men beside him and the grandfather behind him, had a 3-month backlog and a list of designers who had come through Brooks' network and arrived the same way she had, unannounced, looking for the real thing. Each of them found the same barn, the same inventory, the same 3 people who didn't stop working to explain themselves. By his 22nd year, the pricing had adjusted to reflect what the market kept confirming. Marcus no longer apologized for wait times or qualified the rates. Cal had told him once that the biggest mistake a craftsman makes is charging what they think the customer will accept rather than what the work actually costs to do well. Marcus had internalized that slowly, and by 22, it had become simply the way he operated. Roy Greer read the profile of Ellis and Kin in a regional design magazine on a Saturday morning at the diner. He drove past the Ellis property on his way home, the same county road he had been driving past for years, and slowed down. The barn was lit from inside on a Saturday evening, all 3 of them still working. Roy sat idling at the edge of the gravel drive for a long moment. He had been the one who slowed his truck on the day the first load arrived and asked if the sawmill was using their land as a dump. He had been the one who laughed at the word arrangement. He had been the one who told a 16-year-old boy that what he was looking at was somebody's garbage. He pulled away from the driveway without stopping. There was nothing left to say that the barn hadn't already said better. On a Tuesday in October of Marcus's 24th year, the Grantham truck came down the road one more time. Marcus walked out in worn barn boots and a canvas jacket with sawdust pressed into the cuffs. The driver lowered the bed, and a new slab came to the ground, 30 inches wide, the live edge curving in a long, slow arc. Along one side, the grain running straight through the center before rippling outward in the dense, wavy lines that appeared only in maple grown under particular stress. Marcus crouched beside it. He set his hand flat on the surface and felt the wood the way his grandfather had taught him, without meaning to, slowly without rushing toward a conclusion, reading what was actually there. Dale Hutchins had ridden along that day. He climbed out of the truck and stood a few feet back watching. After a moment, he spoke. "When I knocked on your door 8 years ago, I genuinely believed I was the one doing you a favor." Marcus looked at the slab. "You were," he said, "just not the kind you thought." Dale nodded and got back in the truck. Marcus stayed crouched beside the wood a little longer. He thought about the bank teller who had looked twice at his name, about Roy Greer rolling down his window, about the craft market booth in the far corner of the exhibition hall, about Cal's door and the 2 trips it had taken to open it, about his mother in the driver's seat, about his grandfather's voice on a Saturday in the barn, the words that had taken 8 years to land correctly. Earl Ellis had not been talking about wood. Marcus understood that now in the complete way, the way you understand something when you have lived it rather than just heard it. His grandfather had been talking about what happens when you refuse to accept someone else's assessment of what a thing is worth. He had been talking about the specific kind of attention that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for recognition, and doesn't stop when the results are slow. Marcus stood up. He brushed the sawdust from his knees. Ray appeared in the barn doorway and lifted one end of the slab without being asked. They carried it inside together, set it against the wall with the rest of the inventory, and got back to work. That's the part of Marcus's story that doesn't make it into the design magazines or the profile pieces, the years when nobody was watching, when the barn was just a 16-year-old, with borrowed books and his grandfather's dull chisels failing quietly in a place where most people had already decided nothing much was going to happen. The sawmill saw waste. The neighbors saw a pile of garbage on a black family's land. What Marcus saw was material that hadn't been understood yet. And that gap between what something looks like and what it actually is turns out to be where most real opportunity lives. Maybe you've got something like that sitting in your own life right now. Not maple slabs, but an idea people have already shrugged at. A skill that doesn't look like a business yet. A piece of land, literal or otherwise, that everyone else has written off. The question Marcus's grandfather was really asking wasn't about wood. It was whether you can see past what something looks like right now to what it could become, and whether you're willing to keep showing up while that gap closes. Most people aren't. That's not a flaw. That's just where attention runs out. If this story found you at the right moment, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you know someone sitting on an idea they've been talked out of, someone working on something the world hasn't recognized, yet send this their way. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is show them a story that says, the material is there. The question is whether you'll do something with it. Marcus did.